Hi.
Hello everyone. You're probably aware that Christianity wasn't called Christianity. Christians weren't called Christians at first. It appears that it was the unbelievers who called them Christians. What Christianity appears to have been called in the book of Acts is the way. So you link that in your mind to what Christ is claiming to be the way. So those who follow him follow the way, literally, in the case of Christ, and morally and ethically in the way of they're trying to live up to the pattern that Christ lived, the sacrificial living. So yes, but the modern mind says to all of this, I think Christianity is linked to the sacrifice of the mind more than the sacrifice of a life. Unfortunately, that's the common conception. We have to deal with it. So isn't Christianity a religion for deluded or weak minds, or for wishful thinkers at least? Here's some names: Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Pascal, Newton, Faraday, and Kelvin. Well, these are among the most famous names of science. And they're all Christians. So when we look at science, do we think of Christianity? No, we're trying to think that somehow these fields are opposed to each other. Then philosophy. So Augustine, Aquinas, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, John Locke, Berkeley. These are philosophers who are also believing Christians. Then there's literature. We've already named in the last video Tolstoy. We add to that another most famous Russian novelist of the same period, Dostoevsky, also a Christian, as well as Tolstoy. Milton, Dickens, innumerable authors in the Christian tradition. And then there's music: Bach, Handel, Mozart, Beethoven, Stravinsky. All of these were Christians in at least proclamation. And yet, therefore, what of the argument that feeble-mindedness goes along with Christianity? And can you make the claim that they're using Christianity as a crutch? No. These musicians, for instance, all of them wrote sacred works, showing their true conviction. And while it is true that wishful thinking and self-delusion may account for some religious beliefs, I think we would concede that, the religious do not have a corner on self-deception. Lee Strobel, for instance, in the video we've already shot on his life, remembers back to his unbelieving self before he became a Christian and realizes and admits that he wasn't really being fair to the evidence. He'd never really considered the evidence in his arrogance of unbelief. He remembers the reasons he used to have as being fairly superficial, like they are with most people. Aldous Huxley, that's obviously a name associated with a famous novel, Brave New World. And he was no Christian. He was a skeptic, and he came from a family of skeptics, among which was Thomas Huxley, who was the man who popularized Charles Darwin's theories in the Western world. But Aldous Huxley admits that his motives for rejecting religion were hardly objective. He says they were principally moral. So check out the biographies of Huxley and even his autobiography, where he admits that he was not objective in the way he was looking at the claims of Christianity. So historian Frederick W. Farrer sums up the options if we try to explain Christianity without accepting the witness of the New Testament. The greatest ethical and moral force the world has ever known is based on deception, either deliberate or self-deception. That's from Farrer's book, The Witness of History to Christ. A related issue: isn't Christianity responsible for slavery, oppression of women, etc.? So we should start by just talking about the history of slavery. We've only seen certain types of slavery in the last 400 years, but it is estimated that somewhere between a third and half of the Roman Empire was slaves. So even numerically, we've made great strides over 2,000 years. It was a universal fact in the ancient Roman Empire, which considered itself liberal, after all, civilization. Even wives, though, and children were viewed as property in those days. So although we can talk about the oppression and cruel treatment of slaves, they were viewed as property for sure, but so were family members.
Yeah. So we're talking pre-Christian history. Do we really think Christianity made things worse or invented it?
No, Christianity accomplished the gradual amelioration, that is improvement of this oppression, and it did it without violence. It did it without violence and revolution.
Sometimes just by example. So, when you talk about the early Christians, they used to see children being thrown out, exposed to death. And they would collect them and raise them themselves.
We'll get to infanticide in a minute. I think thinking of the difference it's made just in that one area would be a phenomenal refutation of the claim made that somehow the world has deteriorated in the light of Christianity. But I think the contrast, that is, that Christianity accomplished this amelioration of Roman society, as Constantine admitted, by making it the official religion of the Roman Empire, without violence, in contrast to Islam, rationalism, which came in with the French Revolution, began to be the dominant point of view among the intelligentsia, and also in contrast with Marxism, because Marxism, an officially atheistic philosophy, is accountable for more deaths than even the 2 world wars. And I think very few people know that. So we can, if you want to blame Christianity, that is belief for 2 world wars, which I think is extremely irrational accusation, then you have to blame anti-Christianity for the deaths in the Marxist societies in the 20th century, which would exceed 100 million between China and Russia. While it cannot be denied that many responsible for modern slavery claim to be Christians, how many know that the single most influential force in the anti-slavery movement was an evangelical Christian, William Wilberforce? So we have already advocated for watching the movie Amazing Grace, which tells the story of Wilberforce and the abolition movement. We'll also link
we did a video
review
about Wilberforce, Wheat and Weeds.
Wheat and Weeds and Wilberforce. And parallel sacrifices might be cited. People who were either influenced by Wilberforce or by John Wesley's Wesleyanism or Methodism in the English-speaking world. Other people like Shaftesbury, Lord Shaftesbury. We know that name from geography, from streets and from city squares and stuff like that. But how many people know who Shaftesbury is? That he was the single greatest reformer in the area of social industrial progress of the 19th century. John Howard, prison reform. William and Catherine Booth, founders of the Salvation Army. Thomas Barnardo, who was a pioneer in the care of street children or waifs. They're all Christians. The rationalist historian Lecky, who we referred to in the previous video, lived during this era of great social improvement when all those people were alive. And he had to grant that in the net, as opposed to in every case, Christianity was responsible for most of the philanthropy in that period, the social net as we now call it. He conceded that Christians were in the lead in the areas of philanthropy. Infanticide you just brought up. What was the situation for family members and certainly newborn children when Christ came into the world?
Well, if they didn't want children, it was not considered wrong, I guess, for them to leave the children out. If it wasn't, I guess. I mean, I know in countries today there's still this happening, where if it's not a male child, female children are left to die. And Christians, even today, often are the ones that rescue them and raise them.
But certainly in the Roman Empire,
that was the custom, to go around and collect these unwanted children.
So Christianity not only built the hospitals that became everywhere apparent in the Western world, the civilized world as we call it, but they were well known even among their pagan neighbors for being generous to the non-Christian. And especially that phenomenon, that the children thrown out by the pagans were being adopted by. We don't know if it meant that in local congregations people were assigned to go around to the garbage dumps looking for kids, but that was the nature of Christianity. That's what it was characterized by in the first 3 centuries. So we wanted to read one scripture that, well, I think this would epitomize what Lecky says about the softening influence of Christianity, and that is Matthew 18. Remember that even in a Jewish context, somehow the disciples got the impression that Jesus was not about children. And yet Matthew 18 verses 1 to 6 tell us they got a shock.
At that time the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly, I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea."
So those who are specialist historians specializing in social history make this point. We're going to put links in right now to 2 videos, one being The Wheat and the Weeds, Wilberforce, and also to Schmidt, who shows that women were elevated to a new status in society by the coming of Christ and Christianity. So do we think that forever children have been treasured and exalted to the position where you would sacrifice your life for children? That wasn't a common attitude in the world. Children were viewed as an inconvenience by many people who considered themselves civilized.
Or owned.
Children were owned.
Even by their own family.
By their own father. And women were owned by their father and or their husband. So do we think that these complaints that we have about Christianity are in the net, as Lecky puts it, justified? No, only those of us who are ignorant of history, completely ignorant of ancient history, would make the point that Christianity has been a net deterioration in civilization.
It's this desire for instant change and kind of just pretend there's no history going on. There's nothing happening in society and it just changes overnight. Everything's good.
Obviously the answer then is that we've got to know our history better, including our biblical history, because we can see that there was an advancement from Abraham to Christ. Well, there's been an advancement from Christ to today in many ways, but the clouds are put on our horizon by the media, who continue to make some kind of case that patriarchy, by which they mean Judeo-Christianity, is somehow deleterious to our health. So we want to put those links into Schmidt's book on the elevation of women, videos we've already done on that, and also to Wilberforce's influence, which, by the way, is not only not known by Christians, but completely ignored by cults such as Jehovah's Witnesses, who don't even put a reference to Wilberforce and the anti-slavery movement in their literature.
And one more thing. At the end we will, or in our description, we'll put our email so you can get the PDF of this information. Yeah,
I know there's a lot of historical information here, so we do have a PDF of this updated.
Yeah, with references,
So check out the description of this video. See you next time.